Naomi's fingers didn't just brush the silk of Jin Sok-hoon's collar. They twisted into the expensive fabric, jerking the billionaire mafia boss downward until his rigid composure was forced to meet her steady, intense gaze. "Don't look left," she breathed, her voice a low vibration against his lips that felt more like a command than a plea. "The man you pay to take a bullet just sold yours to a professional. Move now or bleed." Jin Sok's hand clamped onto her bare shoulder, not a caress, but the lethal reflex of a predator used to eliminating threats. Then the heavy air of the terrace was torn apart. A silenced round hissed through the space where his head had been 3 seconds before, shattering a crystal decanter into 1,000 diamond-like shards. Midnight at the Blue Lotus, and the entrance smelled like rain-soaked asphalt, mixing with something Naomi Higgins had learned to identify as the scent of absolute power. Sandalwood, perhaps, or the crisp metallic tang of newly minted ink, the particular aroma of money so vast it had stopped trying to announce itself. It was the kind of smell that clung to men who didn't just live in cities, but owned the ground they walked on. Men who moved through the world as if physics itself bent differently around their bodies. Naomi stood by the heavy glass doors she had just opened, shivering slightly as the damp New York wind swept through her off-shouldered dress, carrying the static electricity of a looming storm. Jin Sok-hoon paused on the threshold. He wasn't walking out yet, just standing there with a phone in his hand, his profile etched in sharp, cold geometry against the warm amber light spilling from the lounge. At 40, he carried himself with a stillness so profound it made noise feel like a personal insult and movement seem vulgar. His jaw was a blade of granite, all clean lines and heritage bone structure that suggested a life where weakness was cauterized early. His dark eyes reflected the city lights without absorbing them, as if even photons knew better than to linger on a man who saw everything as a calculation. The transition from the velvet-lined luxury of the Blue Lotus to the concrete veins of the service tunnels was a violent descent. Naomi didn't release his collar until they were behind the heavy industrial door of the freight elevator, the air inside smelling of hydraulic fluid and cold metal. Jin Sok-hoon didn't move. He stood in the center of the vibrating lift, his eyes fixed on Naomi with a lethal intensity that would have withered a lesser woman. "You have 5 seconds to explain why I shouldn't kill you where you stand," he said, his voice a low melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. Naomi didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers steady as she tapped the panel for the basement, not the lobby where his motorcade was waiting, and certainly not the VIP garage. "Your head of security, Park, he just used a dead man's confirmation hand signal to a spotter in the building across the street. If I hadn't pulled you down, your brains would be decorating that terrace right now." Jin Sok's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaped in his cheek. He was a man who'd built an empire on the absolute loyalty of his circle, yet he didn't argue. He was too smart for denial. Instead, he reached into his jacket for his encrypted radio. "Don't," Naomi snapped, her hand darting out to cover his. "If Park is compromised, the entire channel is a trap. They aren't just looking for you, they're tracking your signal. If you key that mic, you're giving them a homing beacon to our exact floor." The elevator groaned to a halt. When the doors slid open, they were met with the dim, flickering fluorescent hum of the service level, a labyrinth of steam pipes and laundry chutes. Naomi stepped out first, her movements fluid and purposeful, the off-shoulder black dress now an anchor she ignored. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "You move now or you wait for them to realize the sniper missed. I promise you, they won't miss twice." Jin Sok followed, his silk-lined footsteps silent on the oil-stained concrete. As they moved deeper into the tunnels, the reality of the betrayal began to settle into the air between them like ash. Every shadow felt heavier. Every hiss of a steam pipe sounded like the cocking of a hammer. They reached a junction where the main security monitors hummed behind a reinforced glass partition. Naomi pulled Jinsok into the darkness of a recessed doorway just as 3 of his own men he had personally vetted, men who had eaten at his table, sprinted past toward the elevator they had just vacated. They weren't moving to protect him. They were moving in a tactical formation, weapons drawn and suppressed. The silence that followed their passage was deafening. Jinsok leaned against the cold brick wall, the warm gold light of the club upstairs now a distant memory. He looked at Naomi, really looked at her, seeing the way her eyes scanned the perimeter with a professional's precision. "You aren't a waitress," he murmured, the realization shifting the dynamic between them. The power he usually projected was momentarily dampened by the sheer scale of the treachery, leaving only the raw analytical core of the man. "I'm the person who knows how to get you out of here alive," Naomi replied, her gaze meeting his. "But we have to assume the perimeter is closed. The main exits, the cars, even the safe houses, they're all red zones now. Park knows your protocols better than you do. He's already ahead of your next move." "Then we change the game," Jinsok said, his voice regaining its sharp, commanding edge. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming silver key. "There is a maintenance crawl space 300 yards east of here that connects to the old subway lines. It's not on the maps. It hasn't been used since the 70s. "The old Punatic tunnels," Naomi whispered, her mind already mapping the subterranean geography. "If we can reach the junction at 42nd, we can disappear into the civilian crowd before they can reset their perimeter." They moved again, a shadow and a ghost, navigating the belly of the city. The emotional arc of the night had shifted from the adrenaline of a near-death experience to the cold, hard weight of isolation. For Jinsok, the world had shrunk to the size of this woman and the damp concrete path ahead. For Naomi, the invisibility she had spent 3 years perfecting was gone, stripped away by the necessity of survival. As they reached the rusted iron hatch of the crawl space, Jinsok paused, his hand on the lever. He looked at the woman who had grabbed his collar and saved his life, the nobody who was clearly someone extraordinary. "Why save me?" he asked. "You could have walked away. You could have let the bullet find its mark and faded into the rain." Naomi looked at the shadows behind them, where the men who had sold their souls to Park were closing in. "I don't like messy patterns, Jinsok, and a man like you being killed by a man like Park, that's a very ugly pattern." She turned the lever, and as the hatch creaked open into the yawning dark of the tunnels, they stepped through together, leaving the lives they knew behind in the blood-stained luxury of the world above. The transition from the maintenance hatch to the safe house was a journey through the skeletal remains of the city. The space was a nondescript loft in a neighborhood where the streetlights were more suggestion than reality. Inside, the air was filtered and cool, smelling of ozone and high-end security hardware, a stark contrast to the damp, metallic scent of the tunnels. Jinsok moved to the center of the room, his presence immediately claiming the space, despite the dirt on his tailored suit. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped an assassination. He looked like a king preparing for a counteroffensive. Naomi didn't wait for an invitation. She moved to a workstation tucked into a corner, her fingers flying across a keyboard with a rhythmic precision that had nothing to do with taking drink orders. The off-shoulder dress shifted as she worked, the elegant fabric looking increasingly out of place against the glowing blue light of multiple monitors.
"You're not just pulling data," Jinsok observed, his voice cutting through the hum of the servers. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, yet he remained perfectly still. "You're rewriting the encryption as you go. That's not a skill learned in the service industry." Naomi's gaze didn't waver from the screen. "In the service industry, you learn to see what people are trying to hide. In my previous life, I learned how to make sure they couldn't hide it at all. She hit a final key, and a waterfall of financial data began to cascade down the center screen. I've bypassed the Gumriang Syndicate's primary firewall. Park didn't just sell you out, he redirected the shell accounts used for your security payroll. He's been bleeding you dry for 6 months, Jin-suk. You weren't just a target tonight, you were an expense he decided to cut. Jin-suk leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ledgers. The numbers were a labyrinth of offshore transfers and ghost corporations, designed to be invisible to anything but a forensic god. He saw the patterns, the minute discrepancies that indicated a master at work. His hand came down on the desk, not in anger, but in a sudden, sharp realization. 3 years ago, the O'Malley family lost their entire liquid infrastructure in 48 hours. Jin-suk said softly, his voice dropping into a dangerous, appreciative register. A ghost analyst, someone the intelligence community called the Cipher, turned their own ledger into a suicide note. They spent $50 million trying to find her. They're still looking. Naomi finally turned in her chair. The calm intensity in her expression was a mirror of his own. The O'Malleys were sloppy. They thought fear was a substitute for math. It isn't. The silence in the safe house shifted. It was no longer the silence of two strangers in a storm. It was the heavy, charged quiet of two predators recognizing each other's weight. Jin-suk looked at the woman who had spent years carrying plates and smiling at monsters, hiding a mind that could topple empires. "The Cipher," he repeated, the name tasting like smoke. "You didn't just save my life because you hate ugly patterns. You saved me because you knew exactly who was holding the pen. I saved you because if you die, the vacuum you leave behind creates a chaos I can't calculate," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "And because I'm tired of being a ghost, Jin-suk. If Park and the CIA are moving on you, they'll eventually find the woman who is standing next to you. I'd rather face them with a partner who has something to lose than wait for them to find me in a diner." Jin-suk reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch that was surprisingly light, yet possessed the same absolute stillness as his gaze. For the first time, the intimacy without warmth began to fracture. There was a spark of something visceral, a shared understanding of the cost of power. "You bankrupted a cartel with a keystroke," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers. "And now you've stepped out of the shadows for a man you don't even know." "I know enough," Naomi said, not pulling away. "I know you're the only person in this city with enough resources to help me burn the people who took my life away. Park is just the beginning." Jin-suk straightened, his posture regaining its rigid authority, but the way he looked at her had changed. She was no longer a waitress to be protected or a witness to be managed. She was a weapon. And for a man like Jin-suk Un, a weapon was the only thing worth trusting. "Then we don't just survive tonight," he said, turning back to the monitors where the digital blood of his empire was still flowing. "We make them wish they had aimed for the waitress instead." The digital silence of the safe house was broken only by the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of keys as Naomi navigated a world that had forgotten she existed. To find the buyer, she couldn't simply search the open web. She had to reach into the Ghost Protocol, a network of dead drops and encrypted servers she'd built during her years as the Cipher. These were contacts that didn't have names, only signatures, digital echoes of people who traded in secrets the way others traded in stocks. Jin-suk watched her from the shadows of the kitchenette, a glass of water in his hand that he hadn't touched. He was a man accustomed to seeing the work of professionals, but Naomi's process was different. She wasn't just hacking, she was performing a high-wire act across a fractured landscape of data. "The signal I'm looking for won't be in the money trail,"
Naomi said, her eyes reflecting the neon green and white of a command line interface. Park is smart, but he's arrogant. He thinks that because he deleted his history on your servers, it's gone. But every transaction leaves a shadow in the cooling systems of the banks he used. I'm tracking the thermal footprint of his betrayal. She paused, her fingers hovering over a specific sequence. A prompt appeared on the center screen, flickering with an amber warning. Access restricted. Biometric override required. This was my old handler's back door, she murmured, more to herself than to Jin-Sok. If I open this, they'll know the cipher is active. The CIA, the cartels, the O'Malley's, every sensor from Langley to Seoul will ping. Jin-Sok stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the monitors. Then we make sure the information we get is worth the price of being seen. If you're going to burn your camouflage, Naomi, make sure the fire consumes Park too. Naomi took a breath, the absolute stillness she had admired in Jin-Sok now mirroring in her own posture. She reached into the small locket she wore, a piece of jewelry that looked like a cheap trinket but held a microchip encased in resin. She slotted it into the drive. The screen bled from amber to a deep, visceral red. The Ghost Protocol opened. Files began to unfurl like digital smoke. Encrypted messages, surveillance stills, and wiretap transcripts poured into the safe house's local drive. Naomi leaned in, her lip-reading skills subconsciously activating as she scanned grainy video files of meetings in darkened parking garages. "There," she said, pointing to a figure in a nondescript gray suit standing next to Park. The man's face was blurred, but his posture was unmistakable. He stood with the rigid, bureaucratic slouch of a man who worked for the government but was paid by someone else. That's Julian Vane. He's a lead strategist for a private intelligence firm called the Aegis Group. They're a front for the CIA's off-book operations. Jin-Sok's grip on his glass tightened until the knuckles of his hand turned white. Aegis. They've been trying to stabilize the shipping routes in the East Sea for years. They don't want to destroy my syndicate. They want to nationalize it. They want a puppet king.
They didn't just buy Park, Naomi added, her voice dropping an octave as she opened a final document, a digital bill of sale for a soul. They offered him a seat at the table, a federal pardon for every crime he's committed under your name, and a directorship in the new regime. Park wasn't just selling you out, Jin-Sok. He was buying his way into the light. The realization that the threat wasn't just a disgruntled employee, but a calculated move by a global superpower shifted the temperature in the room. The sophisticated noir of their surroundings felt thinner now, as if the walls of the safe house were made of paper. Jin-Sok turned away from the screens, his face a mask of cold fury. They think they can treat my life like a line item in a budget. They think because they have a flag and a badge, they can play God with the empire I bled to build. Naomi closed the Ghost Protocol, the red light fading back to the sterile blue of the safe house. They have the resources of a government, but they have the weakness of a corporation. They're risk-averse, Jin-Sok. They only move when they think the outcome is guaranteed. She stood up, the off-shoulder dress finally feeling like a suit of armor. She looked at the man who had been her target, her protector, and now her partner in a war that had just gone global. Vane is the one holding the leash, Naomi said. If we take him out of the equation, the Aegis Group will cut their losses and leave Park to the wolves. But to get to Vane, we have to go where the invisible people play. Jin-Sok met her gaze, his dark eyes reflecting the cold, calculated fire of a dragon. Then we go to the heart of the machine. If they want to see how a ghost fights, we'll give them a haunting they'll never forget. The partnership was no longer a matter of survival. It was a matter of vengeance. And in the silent, high-tech sanctuary of the safe house, the cipher and the dragon began to map out the destruction of a world that thought it was untouchable. Leaving the digital sanctuary of the safe house felt like stepping off a cliff into a dark sea.
The city above was no longer Jinsuk's kingdom. It was a grid of hostile sensors and waiting bearers. As they descended into the rain-slicked reality of a forgotten industrial district, the shift in power became visceral. Jinsuk reached instinctively for the rear door of a black sedan idling at a curb, his hands stopping mid-air as Naomi's fingers clamped around his wrist. "That's a trap," said Naomi, her voice a sharp, low whip. "It's a late-model fleet vehicle, GPS-tethered and likely equipped with an interior cabin mic. Park knows you like comfort, Jinsuk. He's counting on your habit of being chauffeured." Jinsuk's jaw set, his eyes flashing with the frustration of a man who hadn't opened his own car door in a decade. "Then we take a taxi. We move fast." "We take the bus," Naomi countered, already turning toward a dimly lit corner where a rusted transit sign leaned against a brick wall. "Taxis have registries and digital dispatch logs. A bus is a mobile crowd. It's anonymity on a schedule." Jinsuk stood frozen for a heartbeat, the rain beginning to ruin the sharp lines of his suit. To any passerby, he looked like a fallen god, composed, rigid, and entirely out of place. "I don't do public transit."
Naomi turned back, her expression flat, her eyes reflecting the cold amber of a nearby street lamp. "Then you do death, because right now, Jinsuk, your usual way is a map to your grave. You wanted the cipher, this is how the cipher moves. You either follow my lead or you go back to that sedan and see how long it takes for the Aegis group to stabilize your heart rate to 0. The silence between them was a battlefield. Jinsuk was used to being the center of gravity, the one whose absolute stillness commanded armies. But here, in the damp shadows of the underbelly, Naomi was the one who understood the terrain. With a slow, measured breath that suggested a massive internal will of effort, Jinsuk stepped away from the sedan. He followed her to the bus stop, standing 3 paces behind her, like a disgraced general in the wake of a scout. When the bus arrived, a screeching, salt-stained beast, the contrast was almost comical. Jinsuk stepped onto the ribbed metal floor, the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hitting him like a physical blow. He reached for his pocket, but Naomi had already swiped a prepaid card. "Sit in the back, 3rd row from the rear," she whispered as they moved down the aisle. "It's the blind spot for the driver's overhead mirror and out of the direct line of the front-facing security cam." They sat in the dim light, the vibration of the engine rattling the windows. Jinsuk sat with a rigid, upright posture that made him look like a statue placed on a scrap heap. Every time a passenger glanced his way, his muscles coiled, his hand shifting toward the inner pocket of his jacket where a hidden blade rested. "Relax your shoulders," Naomi murmured, her gaze fixed on the reflection in the window, monitoring the street behind them. "You're projecting target. Slump, look tired, look like every other person in this city who is just trying to get through a shift they hate." Jinsuk looked at her, his dark eyes burning with a mixture of resentment and a new, begrudging respect. "You're asking me to disappear. I've spent my entire life making sure I'm the only thing people see." "And that's why you're nearly dead," she replied softly. "In my world, the most powerful person is the one no one remembers. If you want to get to Vane, you have to stop being Jinsuk-hoon and start being a ghost." The emotional arc of the night was beginning to fray his composure. For Jinsuk, the loss of his resources, his drivers, his guards, his encrypted comms was like losing his senses. He felt blind, deaf, and exposed. But as he watched Naomi, he saw the way she used the environment. She used the noise of a passing siren to mask their conversation. She used the glare of a storefront to check their tail. She wasn't just navigating the city, she was wearing it. "Tell me about the pneumatic tunnels again," Jinsuk said, his voice lower now, finally beginning to mimic her cadence. He was learning. He was shedding the weight of his ego, piece by agonizing piece.
"They're the city's old arteries," Naomi said, her eyes never leaving the glass. "Forgotten, dark, and perfect. We'll get off at the next stop, walk 2 blocks north, and enter through a basement laundry in Chelsea. By the time Park realizes we aren't in the safe house, we'll be beneath the foundations of his new empire." As the bus hissed to a stop, Jin-sok stood up. This time, he didn't wait for her command. He adjusted his stance, rounding his shoulders just enough to mask the absolute stillness of his authority. He stepped out into the rain, not as a boss, but as a shadow. The cold alliance had been forged. Jin-sok had learned the most difficult lesson of his life. To survive the predator, you must first become the fog. And Naomi Higgins was the finest fog he had ever seen.
The air inside the abandoned warehouse was thick with the scent of stagnant water and cold iron, a hollow shell that served as a perfect acoustic shadow. 200 yards across the industrial canal sat the Aegis Group's regional hub, a fortress of glass and steel that glowed with a sterile, clinical light. Naomi stood by the jagged remains of a window on the 3rd floor, her body shielded by a rusted support beam. She wasn't using a microphone, she was using a high-powered telescope she liberated from a tactical cache, her eye pressed to the lens with the stillness of a statue. Jin-sok stood behind her in the dark, his presence a heavy, brooding anchor. He had traded his ruined silk suit for a tactical jacket, but his posture remained rigid, his jaw set in that characteristic sharp line. He watched the back of her head, marveling at the focus required to do what she was doing. To the world, the meeting in the glass-walled boardroom across the water was silent. To Naomi, it was a shouting match of intent. "Park is there," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the dark. "He looks restless. He's checking his watch every 30 seconds. He's standing near the window, but his eyes are on the door." Through the lens, Naomi watched the rhythmic movement of Park's lips. She had learned to read the shape of betrayal long before she became the cipher. It was in the way a man's jaw tightened on a hard consonant, the way the breath hitched before a lie. The other man, Julian Vane, is sitting at the head of the table. He's smiling. It's the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. He just said, "The transition needs to be surgical, Park. No loose ends, no martyrs." Jin-sok's hand gripped the edge of a rusted crate, his knuckles white. "He thinks he can manage my execution like a corporate merger." "Wait," said Naomi, her body tensing. "Park is arguing. He's saying Hoon isn't a loose end. He's a ghost. He didn't stay in the car. The waitress, she's the variable we didn't calculate." Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, but her eye remained steady. She watched Vane stand up, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked to the window, looking out toward the very warehouse where they were hiding, though he couldn't possibly see them. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every syllable. "Then we bait the ghost," Naomi translated, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't chase him into the tunnels, we pull him to the vault. Tell the sister we have the girl, he'll come for the child, and he'll bring the cipher with him." The telescope shook for a fraction of a second as Naomi pulled back, her face pale in the moonlight. She looked at Jin-sok, the intimacy without warmth suddenly replaced by a shared visceral cold. "The final trap isn't for you, Jin-sok," she said, her voice cracking. "It's for Minho's sister, Gyun. They know Minho died saving us. They know you feel the weight of that debt. They're using the girl as the bait for the vault at the Chrysler building." Jin-sok's expression shifted from cold fury to something deeper, something more ancient. The absolute stillness of his character didn't break. It solidified into a terrifying resolve. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask for a second look. He simply reached out and took the telescope from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in a way that felt like a silent pact. "They think they understand the debt of a dragon," Jin-sok said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to echo off the warehouse walls. "They think they can weaponize a child's life to balance a ledger."
"The vault is a kill box," Naomi warned, her mind already mapping the security protocols of the Chrysler's private levels. "It's biometric, soundproof, and reinforced with 6-inch lead shielding. If we go in there without a plan, we're walking into our own coffin." "Then we don't go in as targets," Jin-sok said, turning toward the stairs. "We go in as the accountants. You told me the cipher turns ledgers into suicide notes, Naomi. It's time to show the Aegis Group that some debts can only be paid in blood."
The emotional style of the night had reached its peak. The glass room had revealed the enemy's hand, but it had also revealed the depth of the alliance between the waitress and the boss. They were no longer just surviving, they were hunting. As they descended the stairs into the darkness, the city outside felt like a stage being set for a final, violent act. The trap was laid, but the Aegis Group had made one fatal mistake. They had assumed the cipher only worked with numbers. They didn't realize she was now working with a man who had nothing left to lose. The transition from the grimy industrial edge of the city to the gilded lobby of the St. Regis was a jarring descent into a different kind of battlefield. Naomi walked through the revolving doors with a deceptive grace. The off-shoulder black dress she had been wearing since the Obsidian, now a tattered memory, replaced by a borrowed evening gown of deep crimson silk that felt like a second skin. Beside her, Jin-sok moved with his reclaimed absolute stillness, his face a mask of cold aristocratic boredom that hid the predator beneath. They weren't here for a room, they were here for the leverage. "The Aegis team is already floorside," Naomi whispered, her eyes scanning the ornate mirrors of the lobby, using the reflections to track the 3 men in charcoal suits standing by the elevators. "They aren't just watching the exits, they're timing the rotations of the staff. They're expecting us to be desperate. They think we're coming for the girl tonight." Jin-sok's hand rested on the small of her back, a touch that was technically for show, but felt like a low-frequency current. "They think they can box us in. They don't realize they've invited the ghost into their own house." As they reached the 14th floor, the executive lounge where Vane's secondary team was rumored to be staging, the elevator dings were the only warning. The doors slid open to a corridor lined with plush velvet and silent high-piled carpets. Naomi didn't wait. She had already calculated the tactical geometry of the hallway. The ambush was immediate. 2 men stepped from the shadows of a recessed alcove, suppressed pistols raised with a professional's lack of hesitation. "Down!" Naomi hissed, her fingers clamping onto Jin-sok's arm as she spun them into a side service closet. The environment was a luxury trap, and Naomi began to dismantle it with the cold efficiency of the cipher. She didn't have a gun, she had the building's own infrastructure. She reached for the service panel behind the cleaning racks, her fingers moving with the same rhythmic precision she'd used on the safe house keyboards. She yanked the manual override for the floor's fire suppression system. Within seconds, the ceiling began to hiss. A dense, blinding fog of chemical fire retardant mist filled the hallway, turning the gilded corridor into a whiteout zone. The Aegis team, trained for precision, were suddenly blind. "Now," Naomi breathed. She used the silk of her own gown as a tactical anchor. She ripped a long, reinforced strip from the inner lining, a blend of heavy weave and hidden wire she'd prepared in the warehouse. As the first gunman stumbled through the mist, Naomi didn't strike with her fists. She used his own momentum against him. She looped the silk around his lead foot and jerked, the tactical intimacy of the movement bringing him crashing into the marble floor. Jin-sok was a blur of controlled violence beside her. He didn't fight like a street brawler. He fought like a man who viewed every strike as a line of code to be deleted. He intercepted the second gunman, his hand catching the man's throat with a sickening thud, pinning him against the velvet wallpaper as the mist swirled around them. "Where is Vane?" Jin-sok's voice was a low, vibrating rasp, more terrifying than any scream. Naomi moved to the end of the hall, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors of the master suite. She could hear the muffled sound of a radio, the frantic chatter of men who had lost control of their perimeter. She grabbed a heavy, decorative brass floor lamp, snapping the base off to reveal a jagged, weighted rod. "They're moving the girl to the Chrysler vault now," Naomi said, her lip reading unnecessary as the frantic voices spilled through the gap in the door. Vane realized the St. Regis was too public once the alarms went off. "He's running, Jin-suk." She turned back to see Jin-suk standing over the neutralized men, his chest rising and falling in a slow, calculated rhythm. The crimson of her dress was splattered with the dark, wet evidence of the struggle, blood on silk, a pattern of absolute chaos. "Then let him run," Jin-suk said, stepping over the fallen agents. He reached out, his hand hovering near Naomi's cheek, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of adrenaline and a deep, shifting respect. "He's running exactly where we want him, into a box he can't escape." The emotional arc of the night had shifted from survival to the cold, hard geometry of the hunt. Naomi Higgins, the waitress who saw too much, and Jin-suk Hoon, the boss who had lost everything but his resolve, stood in the wreckage of a 5-star ambush. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were the storm. As they slipped back toward the service stairs, leaving the mist-filled hallway behind, the city outside began to pulse with the first light of a pre-dawn sky. The St. Regis had been a test of their partnership, a baptism of fire and silk. Now the Chrysler building and the vault awaited, the final stage where the cipher would finally close the ledger on the men who thought they could own the world. The transition from the blood-stained elegance of the St. Regis to the neon-drenched grime of the city's underground was a descent into a world where silence was the only currency that didn't depreciate. They didn't take a car. They moved through the late-night arteries of the city in a stolen delivery van that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Jin-suk sat in the windowless back, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the vibrating metal walls. He didn't speak, but the air around him felt heavy, pressurized by a fury that had moved past heat and into something cold and absolute. Naomi sat opposite him, her crimson silk gown now covered by a dark tactical trench coat. She was back in the digital ether, her tablet casting a pale blue glow over her features as she traced the final desperate movements of Park's encrypted comms. "He's not at a safe house," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the rattle of the van. "He's at the Iron Ledger. It's an underground casino run by the Guang Syndicate. They don't just take cash, Jin-suk, they take secrets. It's a clearinghouse for information that's too heavy for the dark web." Jin-suk's eyes met hers, the absolute stillness of his gaze more terrifying than any outburst. "The Guang Syndicate hasn't moved against me in a decade. If Park is there, he's not just hiding, he's liquidating." "He's selling the debt of silence," Naomi clarified, her fingers tapping a final command. "Every bribe you've paid, every judge in your pocket, every shipment that bypassed customs. He's putting the foundation of your entire empire up for auction. He knows the Aegis Group will pay to own you, but he's looking for a bidding war." The van came to a halt in a rain-slicked alleyway behind a meatpacking plant. The entrance to the Iron Ledger was a single, unmarked steel door guarded by two men whose necks were thicker than Naomi's waist. They didn't look for ID, they looked for intent. As they stepped out into the damp air, Jin-suk didn't reach for a weapon. He adjusted his cuffs, the sharp lines of his jaw catching the flickering light of a nearby security lamp. He looked like a man walking into his own boardroom, even if that boardroom was buried 3 stories beneath the concrete. "How do we get in?" Jin-suk asked, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "We don't go through the door," Naomi said, her eyes fixed on a ventilation grate near the roofline. "We go through the grid. If we walk in the front, Park's panic will trigger a wipe of the servers. I need to get to the terminal before he hits the delete key on your life."
The emotional arc of the night had reached a point of grim clarity. As they scaled the rusted fire escape, the city's particular electricity felt like a physical weight. Inside the casino, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of expensive cigar smoke and the frantic, silent energy of high-stakes gambling. From their vantage point in the darkened maintenance catwalks, the world below looked like a fever dream of velvet and gold, inhabited by people who traded in the misery of others. Naomi spotted Park in a private alcove, surrounded by 3 Aegis agents. He looked frayed, his usual precision replaced by a twitchy, caffeine-fueled desperation. He was holding a briefcase that Naomi knew contained the physical encryption keys, the only things that could unlock the Ghost Protocol files he had stolen. "He's not just selling to Vane," Naomi whispered, her lip-reading skills locking on to a third party at the table, a woman in a severe gray suit that didn't belong to any syndicate. "That's Holloway. She's a broker for the rival coalition in Seoul. Park is playing both sides against the middle. He's trying to spark a war so he can disappear in the smoke." The emotional arc of the night had reached a point of grim clarity. As they scaled the rusted fire escape, the city's particular electricity felt like a physical weight. Inside the casino, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of expensive cigar smoke and the frantic, silent energy of high-stakes gambling. From their vantage point in the darkened maintenance catwalks, the world below looked like a fever dream of velvet and gold, inhabited by people who traded in the misery of others. Naomi spotted Park in a private alcove, surrounded by 3 Aegis agents. He looked frayed, his usual precision replaced by a twitchy, caffeine-fueled desperation. He was holding a briefcase that Naomi knew contained the physical encryption keys, the only things that could unlock the Ghost Protocol files he had stolen. "He's not just selling to Vane," Naomi whispered, her lip-reading skills locking on to a third party at the table, a woman in a severe gray suit that didn't belong to any syndicate. "That's Holloway. She's a broker for the rival coalition in Seoul. Park is playing both sides against the middle. He's trying to spark a war so he can disappear in the smoke." The betrayal wasn't just about money or a federal pardon. It was an act of nihilism. Park wasn't just leaving. He was burning the house down with everyone inside. Jin-sok leaned over the railing, his dark eyes fixed on the man who had been his shadow for 15 years. The intimacy without warmth that had characterized their relationship was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing void. "He's selling my father's legacy for a seat at a table that will never accept him," Jin-sok murmured. "Then we make sure the table breaks first," Naomi replied. She pulled a small, high-frequency jammer from her pocket, a device that would fry the casino's local network but leave the hardwired terminal intact. "When I drop the lights, you have 30 seconds to reach the alcove. Don't go for Park, go for the briefcase." Jin-sok looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the Mafia boss slipped, revealing the man beneath, the one who had trusted the wrong shadow. "And you?" Naomi asked. "I'll be in the server room," Naomi said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'm going to make sure that when the lights come back on, the only thing left of the Guang Syndicate's secrets is a pattern they can't solve." She triggered the jammer. The transition was instantaneous. The gold and velvet world below vanished into a terrifying, absolute blackness. The silence of the casino was replaced by the sudden, sharp roar of panic, and in that darkness, the dragon moved. He didn't need light to find the man who had betrayed him. He only needed the sound of a heart beating with fear. The debt of silence was about to be collected, and the interest was going to be paid in blood. The darkness of the casino was a fleeting weapon, but the chaos it left in its wake was the perfect shroud for a secondary infiltration. By the time the emergency generators hummed to life, bathing the iron ledger in a dim, spectral red light, the woman in the crimson silk dress had vanished. In her place, moving with the practiced, invisible efficiency of the house staff, was a dealer in a crisp white shirt and a black waistcoat, her hair pinned back with severe precision. Naomi slid into position at the high-stakes baccarat table in the center of the VIP terrace. This was the heart of the calculated risk. Julian Vane sat at the far end, his eyes scanning the room for the ghost he thought he'd lost in the dark, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous cadence on the green felt. He looked like a man who was beginning to realize that the variables were no longer under his control. "Banker's bet," Vane muttered, his voice strained. He didn't look at Naomi's face, he looked at her hands. In a world of high-stakes gambling, the dealer's hands were the only things that mattered, and Naomi's were a masterpiece of deception. As she shuffled the deck, the particular electricity of the room felt like a physical weight against her skin. Hidden inside the ring on her right middle finger was a microscopic acoustic bug, a piece of cipher technology that could pick up the sub-vocal vibrations of a man's throat, even in a crowded room. To plant it, she didn't need to touch him, she just needed to get close enough to bridge the air gap with a magnetic flick. Jinsuk was somewhere in the rafters, a silent guardian watching the perimeter, but for these few minutes, Naomi was entirely alone. She dealt the cards with a fluid, hypnotic rhythm, her eyes focused on the felt, her lip-reading skills catching the jagged, panicked whispers Vane was sharing with the Aegis agent standing behind him. "The girl is at the Chrysler Apex. Secure the elevator keys," Vane whispered, his jaw barely moving. "If Hoon shows up, vent the vault. We don't need him alive for the transfer." Naomi felt a cold spike of adrenaline. The venting of the vault meant a pressurized halon release, a death sentence for anyone inside, including the child. She leaned forward to collect the losing chips, her movement graceful and unobtrusive. As her hand swept past Vane's sleeve, she triggered the ring. The bug leapt the 2-inch distance, snagging into the weave of his expensive wool jacket like a silent parasite. Jin reached for his glass of scotch, his hand brushing centimeters from Naomi's wrist. For a heartbeat, the absolute stillness of the room fractured. He looked up, his gaze narrowing as it finally met hers. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, not of her face, which was masked by the dealer's neutral expression, but of her presence. The intimacy without warmth that had defined her interactions with Jinsuk was absent here. With Vane, there was only the cold, predatory instinct of two hunters realizing they were sharing the same territory. "You have steady hands, dealer," Vane said, his voice dropping into a dark, inquisitive register. "The house always maintains its composure, sir," Naomi replied, her voice a flat, professional mask.
She backed away as the next round began, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that she was careful not to show. She had the audio, she had the location, and she had the confirmation that the Aegis group had moved past corporate takeover and into mass murder. As she transitioned away from the table, slipping back into the shadows near the service bar, a small vibration on her wrist signaled that the link was live. Jinsuk's voice crackled through her earpiece, a low, melodic growl that sounded like a promise of rain. "I have the briefcase, Naomi, and I heard everything. The Chrysler Apex in 20 minutes. "The elevators are keyed to Vane's biometrics," Naomi whispered into her collar as she stripped off the waistcoat, revealing the dark tactical gear beneath. "We don't have 20 minutes. We have to beat the signal." The emotional style of the night had moved from vengeance to a desperate high-speed race against time. Naomi Higgins was no longer the cipher or the waitress. She was the only thing standing between a child and a breathless tomb. She moved toward the service exit, her silhouette merging with the neon-drenched grime of the alleyway where Jinsuk was already waiting, the delivery van idling like a caged beast. The calculated risk had paid off, but the price of the next move was higher than either of them could imagine. They were headed for the Chrysler Apex,
And in the world of the dragon and the cipher, there were no second chances. The transition from the frantic floor of the iron ledger to the pressurized silence of its private vault was like stepping into a tomb designed by a jeweler. The air here was recycled and cold, stripped of the scent of sweat and desperation that defined the casino outside. Jinsok moved first, his silhouette a jagged line of tailored darkness as he stepped into the center of the hexagonal room, the stolen briefcase gripped in his left hand. Naomi followed, her eyes darting across the polished steel surfaces, her pulse a rhythmic staccato against her ribs. In the center of the room, Julian Vane stood flanked by two Aegis operatives, his face pale under the sterile LED glow. Opposite him, Park leaned against the heavy titanium door of the main safe, looking like a man who had finally realized the floor was falling out from beneath him. "You're late for the auction, Jinsok," Vane said, his voice echoing with a hollow metallic timbre. "But I suppose a man of your stature prefers a dramatic entrance. Drop the case." Jinsok didn't move. He stood with that absolute stillness that made him look less like a man and more like an impending disaster. "The girl, Vane, or the only thing you'll be managing is the liquidation of your own career." As the tension in the room thickened, Naomi's gaze drifted past the primary players. She wasn't looking at the guns or the briefcases. She was looking at the reflections in the vault's mirrored corners. In the high-polished bezel of a security camera housing, she caught the rhythmic movement of lips that shouldn't have been there. Hidden in the ventilation recessed into the ceiling, a third party was watching. Naomi's lip reading locked on. The speaker was unseen, but the reflection caught the shape of the words being whispered into a headset. "Wait for Vane to take the key, then vent the room. No survivors, including the Aegis team. We reclaim the girl once the air is clear." The realization hit Naomi like a physical blow. The Aegis group wasn't just betraying Jinsok. Someone within the CIA was betraying Vane. "Jinsok, don't!" Naomi's voice was a sharp, low command that broke the standoff. She didn't look at Vane. She looked directly at the ceiling vent. "Vane, you're being played. There's a cleanup crew in the vents. Your own people are waiting for you to secure the briefcase before they kill us all." Vane's eyes flickered upward, a split second of doubt crossing his face. It was all the opening Jinsok needed. With a movement that was too fast for the human eye to track, Jinsok didn't reach for his gun. He threw the briefcase directly at Park, who reflexively caught it. The weight of the metal case knocked the traitor off balance, sending him stumbling into the vault door. "Look at the monitor, Vane," Naomi shouted, her fingers flying across a localized keypad she'd hacked into moments before. She bypassed the vault's internal privacy screen, forcing the thermal feed from the ventilation shaft onto the main display. 4 heat signatures appeared on the screen, crouched in the ductwork directly above them, weapons aimed down through the grates. "The Ghost Protocol has a failsafe," Naomi said, her voice now cold and analytical, the cipher fully emergent. "If the air pressure in this room drops by even a fraction, the encryption keys in that briefcase will auto-delete. Your cleanup crew is about to turn your multi-billion-dollar asset into a pile of useless silicon." The standoff shifted into a chaotic 3-way triangle of suspicion. Vane's operatives turned their weapons toward the ceiling. Park, realizing he was the designated sacrificial lamb, looked at the briefcase in his hands as if it were a ticking bomb. "Who is it, Naomi?" Jinsek asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He stepped toward her, his body shielding her from the vault's center. "It's Holloway," Naomi replied, her eyes never leaving the thermal feed. "She's not a broker. She's Vane's superior at the agency. She's cutting the middleman out of the budget." The emotional arc of the night had reached its breaking point. The final gambit wasn't about who had the most guns. It was about who had the most truth. "Vane," Jinsek said, his dark eyes locking on to the lead conspirator, "you have 10 seconds to decide if you want to die for a woman who has already replaced you, or if you want to help us get out of this vault." Vane looked at the thermal signatures above him, then at Jinsak, and finally at Naomi. The particular electricity of the room was now a deafening hum of survival. "Lower your weapons," Vane commanded his men, his voice shaking with the realization of his own obsolescence. "The girl is at the Chrysler Apex," Vane muttered, looking defeated. "But the vault door is already locked from the outside. Holloway has the override." "I don't need an override," Naomi said, her fingers already back on the keypad, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'm the cipher. I built the back door to this vault 3 years ago for the O'Malleys. I just didn't tell them where I put the key." As the heavy titanium bolts began to cycle, the sound of the opening door was the only thing louder than the beating of their hearts. They were no longer targets and hunters. They were 3 desperate factions forced into a single bloody path toward the Chrysler building. The gamble had been placed, and as they stepped out into the smoke-filled corridor of the casino, the only thing Naomi knew for sure was that the ledger wasn't just being closed, it was being rewritten in fire. The transition from the fortified vault of the Iron Ledger to the digital front lines was a symphony of controlled destruction. As the delivery van sped toward the towering needle of the Chrysler building, Naomi's laptop became a detonator. She wasn't just deleting files, she was triggering the burning of the ledger, a scorched earth protocol designed to make Jinsek Hoon's vast financial empire look like a house of cards in a hurricane. Jinsek sat beside her, his dark eyes fixed on a secondary tablet that showed the real-time plummet of his holding companies. Stock tickers bled red across the screen, a digital massacre of assets he had spent a lifetime acquiring. "The Aegis Group will see this as their opening," Jinsek said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried no hint of regret. "Vane and Holloway have been waiting for my liquidity to hit zero. They won't be able to resist moving in to claim the wreckage." "That's the point," Naomi replied, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, blurring speed that defied the sway of the van. "While they're busy trying to catch the falling knives of your subsidiary stocks, I'm slipping into the central hub of the global banking grid. I'm not just hiding your money, Jinsek. I'm making Jinsek Hoon and Naomi Higgins mathematically impossible to find." The emotional arc of the night had moved into the territory of the irreversible. To save the girl and end the war, they had to commit a form of social suicide. Naomi triggered the first of 10 logic bombs. Across 3 continents, servers belonging to the Gumriang syndicate began to purge. Real estate deeds vanished. Bank accounts were rerouted through a series of dark pools before being converted into untraceable crypto assets, and facial recognition databases in every major transit hub suddenly suffered a catastrophic formatting error regarding 2 specific profiles. "I'm deleting the fingerprints," Naomi whispered, the blue light of the screen illuminating the cold, clinical focus in her eyes. "The passports, the tax records, the birth certificates. By the time the sun comes up, we won't just be ghosts, we'll be myths." Jinsok reached out, his hand covering hers on the keyboard for a fleeting second, a touch that was heavy with the weight of what they were losing. "You're sure about this? There's no coming back from the cipher's burn." "I've been a waitress for 3 years, Jinsok. I've been practicing for this my whole life," she said, meeting his gaze. "The only thing that matters is the girl at the apex." As the van swerved into the private subterranean loading dock of the Chrysler building, the final phase of the burn completed. The Aegis Group's monitors would currently be screaming with the news of a total Mafia collapse, drawing every high-level agent, including Holloway herself, toward the loot they thought was theirs for the taking. They stepped out of the van into the echoing silence of the garage. Jinsok adjusted his cuffs one last time, his absolute stillness returning as he prepared to face the people who thought they had already won. He looked like a man who had lost a kingdom, but Naomi knew better. He had traded an empire of paper for a partnership of blood. "The ledger is burned," Naomi said, snapping her laptop shut and sliding it into her tactical pack. "The enemies are in the light. Now we just have to survive the fire."
They moved toward the high-speed express elevators, two people who officially no longer existed, heading toward a final confrontation at the top of the world. The particular electricity of the city was now a roar in their ears, the sound of a world ending and a new, darker one beginning. The trap was set, the identities were erased, and the dragon and the cipher were ready to collect the final debt. The transition from the deafening chaos of the Chrysler Building to the absolute velvet silence of the Seoul night was a passage through a mirror. The city below was a sprawling tapestry of neon and rain, a rhythm of life that moved forward without any knowledge of the two ghosts who had just stepped onto its shores. In the quiet of a high-rise apartment overlooking the Han River, the particular electricity of New York was gone, replaced by the cool, steady pulse of a new beginning. Jin-sok stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette etched in the soft glow of the city lights. He had discarded the tactical gear and the ruined suits of his former life, wearing a simple linen shirt that made him look less like a mafia boss and more like a man who had finally found a shore to rest upon. His absolute stillness remained, but the tension in his jaw had softened, the predatory edge of his gaze replaced by a profound, reflective calm. Naomi sat on the edge of a low sofa, her fingers moving over a tablet one last time. This wasn't an act of war or a tactical breach. It was the final stitch in the shroud they had woven for their past. She hit a single key, and the last tether to their old lives, a dormant offshore account that had served as their final safety net, dissolved into a million untraceable fragments. "The cipher is officially dead," Naomi whispered, her voice carrying a weight of relief that seemed to echo in the sparse room. "And Jin-sok Hoon is a name that exists only in history books and police archives. We are nobody, Jin-sok, truly nobody." Jin-sok turned from the window, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a clarity that felt more intimate than any touch. The intimacy without warmth that had defined their first meeting at the Obsidian had transformed into something rare and unbreakable, a partnership forged in the fire of shared survival. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and unhurried, and sat beside her. "I spent my life building walls so high no one could climb them. I thought power was the only way to be safe. But the only time I was truly safe was when I was standing in the dark with a waitress who grabbed my collar and told me the truth." Naomi looked at the girl, Jiyoon, who was sleeping soundly in the adjacent room, Minho's sister, the new North Star that had guided them through the final storm. The child was the only piece of the past they had allowed themselves to keep, a living testament to the debt of silence they had finally paid in full. "We're holding all the cards now," Naomi said, her hand coming to rest on Jin-sok's arm. "But the game is over. There are no syndicates to run, no cartels to bankrupt, and no ghosts to chase. Just the city, the rain, and whatever we decide to build tomorrow." Jin-sok reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with the same tactical precision he had always possessed. But this time, the touch was filled with a quiet, grounding warmth. The emotional arc of their journey had reached its final resolution. They were no longer the predator and the prey, the boss and the servant. They were two architects of their own fate, standing in the center of a world that didn't know they existed. Outside, the rain began to fall over Seoul, a gentle, rhythmic sound that washed away the last traces of blood and silk. The dragon had walked away from his empire, and the cipher had deleted her own legend. Together, they watched the lights of the city flicker and pulse, the new North Star shining brightly over a life where they were finally, for the first time, free to be nothing at all. They had disappeared, really disappeared, and as the dawn began to break over the Han River, they knew that for the first time in their lives, the sunrise belonged entirely to them.